Welcome to the first session of the 2024 Energy Academy. We're really delighted to have you all with us. Today we're going to be giving an update on recent industry activity. I'm Katie Miller, an associate in the oil and gas team, and I am joined by my colleague Steph Hendry, who is a senior solicitor in the oil and gas team. So our topics today, we're going to have a look at licence award, change of control in respect of licensees, electrification, decommissioning, and information sharing in respect of carbon capture and storage. So I will pass on to Steph, who's going to kick off our session.
Good morning, everyone. So firstly, we're going to touch upon two of the recent updates which relate to licence awards. If you've attended our previous Energy Academy sessions, or if you've seen our blog posts on our website or floating around LinkedIn, you'll know that we have been providing updates on the 33rd licensing round. To recap, the 33rd licensing round was the first licensing round to be formulated in compliance with the climate compatibility checkpoint that was published by BEIS in September 2022. So the round opened on the 7th of October 2022 and closed for applications on the 12th of January 2023. Bidders were offered acreage across 931 blocks in the west of Shetland, central North Sea, northern North Sea, southern North Sea, and East Irish Sea. So on the 30th of October 2023, the first tranche of licenses was announced, and within that tranche, the NSTA awarded 27 new licenses, which covered 55 blocks across the central and northern North Sea and the west of Shetland to 14 operators. And the blocks awarded within that first tranche were prioritised as they have the potential to go into production quicker than others. And since then, on the 31st of January 2024, the NSTA announced that it has awarded a further 24 North Sea exploration licenses. So the licenses awarded in this tranche cover 74 blocks and part blocks, all of which are likewise located in the central North Sea, northern North Sea, and west of Shetland areas. And it has been reported that 17 companies have been awarded the licenses. The majority of the remaining blocks to be awarded are located in the southern North Sea and East Irish Sea, and the NSTA has reported that the further licenses will be awarded in the coming months, and that they will be awarded when environmental evaluations such as habitat regulation assessments have been finalised by OPRED. So we'll keep an eye out for further announcements, and we'll of course give further updates as and when they come to light. With regards to licence awards generally, at present, there isn't a requirement for licensing rounds to be run on a regular basis. So for now, the NSTA runs licensing rounds when it deems it necessary. However, on the 8th of November 2023, the Offshore Petroleum Licensing Bill 2023 to 2024 was introduced to the House of Commons. And the purpose of this bill is to place the NSTA under a new duty to run annual applications for new offshore oil and gas production licenses. And the aim of this duty is to provide greater certainty to the industry and potential investors that licensing of the UK's offshore petroleum resources will continue. So the government has stated that the bill aims to achieve the following: make the UK more energy independent and safeguard domestic energy supplies by increasing investor and industry confidence. It aims to enhance the UK's energy security and reduce dependence on higher emissions imports from overseas. It aims to protect the domestic oil and gas industry that supports more than 200,000 jobs and aims to realise the UK's net zero target in a pragmatic, proportionate and realistic way without unduly burdening families and businesses. If you could just go to the next slide, thank you. Under the NSTA's new duty, it would have to carry out 2 tests in each annual period, and that period runs from October to September each year. The 2 tests that require to be met are those set out on the screen. So first is the carbon intensity test, and this test compares the average carbon intensity of domestic gas with the average carbon intensity of imported LNG. And this test would be met if the carbon intensity of domestic gas is lower than the average carbon intensity of imported LNG during the assessment period. And the second test is the net importer test. So it's reported that this test evaluates the scale of both current and future production from the UK relative to the UK's demand for oil and gas over a 15-year period. And this test is met if the UK is projected to remain a net importer for both oil and gas during the assessment period. So if both tests are met, the NSTA will have to publish an application notice inviting applications for new licenses. And I believe the requirement would be that the NSTA must invite applications for at least one license covering at least one block or part block. So by way of progress, the bill was introduced to the House of Commons on the 8th of November 2023. It moved through the House of Commons quite quickly, passing its third reading on the 20th of February this year. The bill then had its first reading in the House of Lords on the 21st of February 2024, and the date of the second reading is yet to be scheduled. So again, something we'll keep an eye on and will provide further updates when necessary. So I'll quickly touch upon change of control. By way of background, the Energy Act 2023 received royal assent on the 26th of October last year. And although the Act largely surrounds low emission technologies, it also contains numerous provisions concerning oil and gas. And one of those provisions is the amendment to the model clauses contained in pieces of legislation, including various petroleum regulations. So the amendments provide that a change in control of a license holder is no longer permitted without the prior consent of the NSTA. So previously, no prior NSTA approval was required under the terms of the license. So while the NSTA could revoke a license due to a change of control, its specific approval wasn't required. Now, if a change in control is contemplated, the licensee must apply in writing to the NSTA for consent at least 3 months prior to the date upon which it is proposed that the change would occur. So following receipt of the application, the NSTA may either unconditionally consent to the change in control, consent to the change in control subject to conditions, or refuse consent to the change in control. So essentially, change of control cannot validly occur without the NSTA's prior consent. And it's worth noting that if there is any breach of any condition subject to which the NSTA gave its consent, the NSTA may revoke such consent. So I'll pass on to Katie, who will touch on electrification and decommissioning.
Thanks, Steph. So as I'm sure all of you will agree, emissions reduction schemes are high on everyone's agenda just now. With power generation reportedly making up 79% of offshore emissions in 2022. The NSTA's view is that platform electrification could significantly reduce the offshore industry's greenhouse gas emissions by sourcing power for platforms, either from shore or from offshore renewable sources. So this is viewed as being critical in meeting the UK's current emissions reduction targets. So that being the case, as part of the North Sea transition deal, the UK's offshore oil and gas industry is expected, or maybe it's better to say is being heavily encouraged to invest in electrification. The key commitment that the sector has been expected to make pursuant to the deal is to invest £2 to £3 billion to allow production to be operated using electricity to help meet the 2030 emissions target. So that's obviously a lot of money and a very large commitment, but there were also several commitments made by the government to support electrification within the deal. So in 2021, the government was expected to identify potential funding opportunities for early stage offshore electrification studies that businesses could then bid into on a match funded basis by the end of 2022. They were also expected to work with the sector to identify potential decarbonisation funding solutions by late 2022. Again, work with the sector to explore the economics of electrification and work to identify the most cost-effective options to unlock investment. So this links into the updated draft OGA plan, which I'll touch on just later in this presentation. And finally, the government was also expected to create and lead a senior offshore implementation group, addressing the regulatory and legislative barriers to electrification and other offshore energy transition matters. So while there was an investment expectation placed on the sector, there was obviously lots of work for the government to be getting on with in the background. And I think it's very fair to say that fairly big steps have been taken to try to meet the expectations placed on the government in the deal and to map out a clear regulatory pathway for electrification schemes. So far, we've seen around £1 million of funding be provided via the NSTA in December 21 to support studies to assess technical and commercial solutions to help decarbonise operations. In addition, a government and regulators electrification network was established, which has been tasked with working with the industry to explore how barriers to electrification can be addressed. And the industry now has some well-developed proposals for electrification projects. A new task and finishing group has been set up to work with the government and regulators electrification network. And the Scottish Government and Crown Estate have developed the INTOG planning and leasing round to support offshore wind farms powering oil and gas assets in Scottish waters. And more recently, on the 20th of February of this year, NST hosted a workshop on platform electrification to discuss the challenges surrounding electrification, as well as technologies that are currently available to support projects. I'm sure some of you on the call were either at that workshop or had colleagues that went to that workshop. So if you'd like to share any feedback with us after this session, that would be hugely interesting to us. So there's clearly some way to go for the sector and the government to get to a point where electrification is where it needs to be or where they think it needs to be, but progress is certainly being made. And it is worth remembering that the North Sea transition deal is non-binding in nature and is more of a statement of intent or a statement of expectation from the NSTA. However, it's important to look at this in tandem with the draft OGA plan. So on the 5th of October last year, the NSTA published the draft OGA plan at the same time as launching a consultation to reduce UKCS greenhouse gas emissions. So it looked at investment and efficiency, platform electrification and low carbon power, inventory, and flaring and venting. So one of the questions posed in the consultation, relevant to the topic today, was, do you agree with the proposed platform electrification and low carbon power requirements as set out in the draft plan? So looking at the draft plan, it's exactly what it is for now, a draft, meaning it's not yet been finalised and is subject to change and amendment pending the outcome of the consultation. However, what it does do is set out NSTA's proposed requirements for how relevant persons can meet the central obligation within the OGA strategy for emissions reductions from oil and gas production. So for the purposes of the draft plan, relevant persons are holders of petroleum licences, operators under petroleum licences, owners of upstream infrastructure, persons planning and carrying out the commissioning of upstream petroleum infrastructure, and owners of relevant offshore installations. And it's important to understand whether or not you are or are not a relevant person, because there are specific requirements placed on relevant persons within the plan. The first such requirement is that if you're looking at a development with a first oil or gas date after the 1st of January 2030, then that development must be fully electrified. This applies also to tiebacks. So if you're looking at a tieback option where first oil or gas will be after the 1st of January 2030, then your host must be electrified. For developments with the first oil or gas date before the 1st of January 2030, there's not the same requirement to be electrified at that point. However, they must at a minimum come online electrification ready. So it's just one more thing to think about. So in addition, relevant persons must include a technical and economic assessment of all potentially available electrification schemes and associated emissions reductions before submitting their FTP concept select. And for existing assets that intend to produce beyond 2030, then there must be an emissions reduction plan in place, including an assessment of whether or not electrification is an option for that asset. So the important takeaway from the draft plan as it stands, remembering that it's yet to be finalised, is that where there are two development plans potentially being weighed up by NSTA, they will usually favour the lower emitting option. In addition, where NSTA considers it reasonable and appropriate to electrify an existing asset, but the relevant persons have opted not to, then there should be no expectation that FDPs or further consents will be approved by NSTA. So in assessing whether electrification is reasonable and appropriate in respect of an existing asset, the relevant person is expected to weigh up the total remaining value of reserves and resources that will or may be developed through that asset and the expected emissions reductions from electrification against the expected cost of electrification. So there is a mechanism in place that the NSTA would expect a relevant person to follow to understand whether or not it's reasonable and appropriate to expect that asset to be electrified, which is helpful and good to know. So the closing observation within the draft plan is that these requirements build on and are consistent with the NSTA's existing net zero expectations set out in the field development plan guidance. So hopefully none of it comes as a massive surprise, and I'm sure these conversations are being had anyway, but it builds on requirements that are already there. And hopefully the updated information in the draft plan provides kind of helpful guidance, if nothing else. So we know electrification has been on lots of operators and licence holders' minds over recent years, and it doesn't seem that that's set to change. So this is one to keep an eye on as we move forward. And now I've just got a really brief update on decommissioning. So on 1st of November last year, Pauline Innes, the Director of Supply Chain and Decommissioning at the NSTA, wrote an open letter to licensees reminding them of their decom obligations in respect of wells. So this was prompted by a number of deferrals being sought, and kind of exceptional circumstances aside, licensees were being reminded that failure to meet a licence requirement in respect of well decom may result in the NSTA's dispute and sanctions team being involved. So the key bits that I've pulled out from the letter, which I'll just read to you now, is that the NSTA said, while we recognise that in recent times there may have been external challenges such as higher than anticipated inflation, the NSTA considers that such challenges generally do not dilute, alter or provide grounds to defer licensee decommissioning obligations. As such, the NSTA expects the obligations to be complied with within the originally specified or agreed timescales. We do not recognise that circumstances, we do recognise, that would be a little bit harsh. We do recognise that circumstances may from time to time arise that might cause an application to defer such obligations to be made. However, the NSTA will only grant such a deferment of a decommissioning obligation in exceptional circumstances, up to but not exceeding the 5-year time limit. So this is really just something to bear in mind, particularly for those who have a number of wells on their decommissioning horizon. I would also flag that if the reason for deferral is to try to aggregate work scopes, share resources, or otherwise collaborate with other operators or other existing campaigns to deliver more cost-efficient decommissioning, then engagement with NSTA should be done very early on to make sure that that doesn't hamper any plans that are being developed. So I will now pass back to Steph for the final update on information sharing.
Yes, so as we know, carbon capture and storage is going to play a crucial part in the UK achieving net zero, with the government aiming to capture and store 20 to 30 million tonnes of CO2 per year by 2030. The Energy Act 2008 provides for a licensing regime which governs the offshore storage of carbon dioxide. And as you may be aware, the UK carried out its first carbon storage licensing round in 2022. And in 2023, 21 offshore carbon storage licenses were awarded. At the moment, the Energy Act 2023 gives the NSTA power to issue notices requiring CS licence holders to report the information and samples acquired or created by or on behalf of the licensee in the course of carrying out activities under the licence to it. And these notices are referred to as Section 112 notices. At present, the information or samples provided by way of the Section 112 notices cannot be disclosed by the NSTA unless it falls under an exception. However, the 2023 Act includes provision for the Secretary of State to make regulations allowing for the public disclosure of information or samples which have been obtained by the NSTA under a Section 112 notice. So in light of this, the NSTA opened a consultation on proposed regulations for the disclosure of carbon storage information and samples on the 14th of February 2024. And the purpose of this consultation is to seek views on the presented proposals for regulations. It's seeking views on which information and samples the NSTA may disclose and the time period after which disclosure can take place. So virtual public engagement sessions are ongoing. The first one occurred on the 7th of March and one will be held on the 20th of March from 11 till 12. So that might be a date for your diary. And thereafter, the consultation closes on the 12th of April 2024. So that's all from me on information sharing. I think we've whizzed through those updates, so we have some time for questions. Just check the Q&A box.
Perfect. So I have just got one that's come in, I think for you, Steph. So with regards to the Offshore Petroleum Licensing Bill, will the NSTA be able to issue licenses outside the annual duty?
Yeah, so my understanding is that the NSTA will remain free to grant licenses outside the new annual duty in its usual way, and that'll be whether or not the statutory tests I mentioned are met. That's a good question. I've just seen one. When do you expect the licenses in the final tranche of the third licensing round to be released? My understanding is that they're aiming for them to be released by the end of Q1, so not too far away. But as I said, we'll provide an update as and when that's released.
Perfect. I've got one that's just come in on electrification. So it says, as you noted, the North Sea transition deal is indicative or non-binding. What is the status of the draft OGA plan? So the plan itself is just in draft for now, even though the consultation closed in November 2023. However, once that plan is finalised, what it essentially does is underpin the strategy, so it does have much more of a binding effect. However, it's important to bear in mind that the safeguards that apply to the strategy will also apply to the plan. So, for instance, if the investment in electrifying an asset wouldn't result in a satisfactory commercial return, then that safeguard that exists under the strategy exists for the plan as well. So it has binding effect, but comes with the same protections that the strategy comes with. Perfect. So I think that is all we've got for now. If we've missed any questions, we will do a double check at the end and we can come back to you by email. But otherwise, I think we'll let you all get some time back in your diaries and hopefully see you for the next. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.